The wipers cut a rhythmic, dull arc across the windshield, fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Carlos watched the city lights smear into long, jagged needles of neon across the glass. Every stoplight was a minute lost. Every traffic jam was a mile of fuel wasted. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, matching the steady, mechanical tick of the taximeter. It was a sound that had defined his last 1,000 nights. A passenger slammed the rear door shut, the echo swallowed instantly by the relentless drum of rain on the roof. Carlos didn't turn around. He watched the man walk away through the side mirror until he vanished into the dark. The cab was empty again. He shifted into drive, but his foot stayed heavy on the brake. He leaned forward, eyes stinging from the glare of oncoming headlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. In the rearview mirror, he caught his own gaze. He looked at the deep lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, and the way the dashboard lights highlighted the fatigue in his skin. The city moved around him, indifferent and relentless, while he remained stuck in the same iron cage he had occupied for years. He reached into the glove box, his fingers brushing against loose receipts and a heavy, worn book. He pulled it out. The edges were soft from years of friction. He flipped through the pages, the paper dry and stiff against his thumb, until he reached the dog-eared corner. He stopped. He read the sentence once, then again, aloud in the quiet cabin. Every great achievement begins with a definite purpose. The words hung in the air, sharper than the hum of the engine. Carlos looked up. He stared at the dashboard, at the plastic buttons and the glowing digital display of the meter. The reflection of the streetlights no longer looked like bars of a cage. He saw the vehicle differently now. It was not a place to wait for the next fare. It was a machine designed to generate the capital he needed to escape this seat forever. He closed the book and slid it back into the compartment. The rain continued to batter the roof, but the rhythm no longer felt like a countdown to exhaustion. It felt like the steady ticking of a clock counting down to his departure. He gripped the wheel, not with the loose hold of a tired driver, but with the firm, calculated intent of a man who had finally mapped his way out. Carlos pulled the taxi into a quiet, shadowed space beneath a bridge. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen glowing harsh and white in the dim cabin. He navigated to his bank app, his pulse thudding against his fingertips. The balance appeared, $3,000. He stared at the digits for a long time. It was the sum of every late shift, every holiday worked, and every meal skipped over the last decade. $3,000. A number that felt both heavy and dangerously small. For a heartbeat, the fear took root in his chest. A cold weight suggesting that 3,000 was not enough to change anything. He breathed in, slow and deep, and forced his eyes to lock onto the screen again. He stopped seeing it as a savings account and started seeing it as a seed. It was enough to secure a deposit. It was enough to stop being a passenger in his own life. He swiped the screen off, leaving the cab in darkness, and tapped his knuckles against the steering wheel. The money was not a pile of cash to be guarded. It was the ammunition for the first strike. He knew exactly what he had to do next. The address on 4th Street sat at the end of a narrow, debris-strewn alley. Carlos slowed the taxi to a crawl, the tires crunching over loose gravel and broken glass. He stopped, leaving the engine idling, and stepped out into the damp morning air. The duplex stood before him, a gray, skeletal structure that looked as though it might collapse under its own weight. Long strips of paint hung from the siding like dead skin. The roof sagged in the center, forming a shallow, waterlogged valley that looked ready to give way. A rusted gate groaned on a single hinge as he pushed it open. He circled the perimeter, his boots sinking into the soft, uneven earth. The wood of the porch felt spongy beneath his weight, and the windows were clouded with layers of grime. To any passerby, the building was a ruin, a liability waiting to be condemned. Carlos stopped by the front entrance and leaned his forehead against the doorframe. He did not look at the rot. He looked through the decay, mapping out the structural bones, the potential for solid walls, and the space beneath the sagging rafters. The stench of damp earth and stagnant water filled his lungs, but he did not pull away. He took a breath, stood straight, and stared at the front door. It was ugly, broken, and exactly what he needed. Carlos pushed into the small office. The air smelled of old paper and stale coffee. A man sat behind a desk cluttered with folders, sliding a single document across the surface. It was the contract. The ink was dark, the lines sharp, and the terms were clear. Carlos sat, the chair scraping harshly against the linoleum floor. He pulled out his checkbook. His hand hovered over the paper, and for a second, the room seemed to tilt. Every hour he had spent in the taxi, every tip he had saved, and every sacrifice he had made were all contained in the numbers he was about to write. He reached for the pen. His fingers felt stiff, and his palm was damp. As he pressed the nib to the paper, his hand betrayed him, shaking with the sheer weight of the moment. He forced his grip to tighten, anchored his wrist against the hard surface of the desk, and pushed the ink into the fibers. The first stroke was jagged, but the second was firm. He finished the signature, set the pen down, and looked at the man. In that moment, the $3,000 was gone, replaced by a legal promise of ownership. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs, and walked out of the office into the blinding afternoon sun. He had done it. He had crossed the line. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in long, harsh shadows. Carlos climbed back into the driver's seat of his taxi. His back ached from the day, and his pulse throbbed behind his eyes. But the contract in his pocket served as a sudden, sharp anchor. He turned the key. The engine hummed to life. He could have gone home, but the property taxes were due, and the duplex waited for nothing. He pulled into the heavy evening traffic, eyes scanning the sidewalk for a raised hand. One fare, then another, then a third. Each passenger was a blur of noise and movement, but Carlos remained detached, his mind focused entirely on the math of the night. He drove until his eyelids felt like lead. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, forcing his focus onto the road ahead. 2 hours passed, then 3. The city lights began to dim as the streets emptied. He finally turned off the meter, the silence in the car feeling heavier than the noise of the traffic had. He checked the total on his dashboard. It was enough. He reached into the glove box, tucked the day's earnings into a separate envelope, and leaned back against the headrest. The physical exhaustion was absolute, but the mission was moving forward. 6 months of steady work had turned the property into a routine. Every morning, Carlos checked the locks and the windows, a habit born of ownership. It was a Tuesday evening when he descended into the basement to check the heating unit. He heard it before he saw it. A sharp, rhythmic hissing echoed against the concrete walls. He reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered and died, leaving him in the dim gray of the twilight filtering through the high, small windows. He took a step forward, and his boot splashed into an inch of cold, murky water. He froze. The sound grew louder, a violent spray erupting from a rusted joint near the ceiling. A jet of water hit the floor with the force of a fire hose, churning up debris and dust. The level rose against his shins within seconds. He lunged toward the main shutoff valve, but the water was already swirling around his ankles, numbing his skin with its sudden, icy bite. The basement was no longer a storage space. It was a bowl filling rapidly, threatening to swallow the foundation he had spent every spare dollar to secure. He reached for the pipe, his fingers searching the darkness for the source of the pressure. Carlos gripped the main valve with both hands and wrenched it clockwise. The hissing slowed, then choked into silence. He stood in the dark, breathing hard, the water still swirling around his knees. He waded to the corner, found his heavy wrench, and knelt in the sludge. The next 48 hours became a blur of cold metal and wet dust. He tore out the rotted, rusted sections of pipe, his muscles screaming with every turn of the wrench. His hands grew raw as he forced the new copper fittings into place, ignoring the sharp edges that bit into his palms. When the plumbing finally held, he turned his attention to the drywall. He hauled sheets of heavy board down the narrow basement stairs, bracing them against the ceiling with his shoulder while he drove nails into the studs. His back burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he did not stop for food or sleep. He worked until the basement was dry and the walls were sealed. By Sunday evening, the only sound in the room was the steady, dry tick of the cooling pipes. He collapsed onto the damp concrete floor, his limbs heavy, staring at the patch of new wood he had built with his own hands. Carlos climbed the narrow basement stairs, his boots leaving thick, wet tracks on the wood. He stepped out into the bright afternoon, still covered in gray drywall dust and dark, damp earth. He squinted against the sun, his shoulders aching, his breath shallow. His friends were waiting near his taxi, holding coffee, their talk loud and easy. As he approached, the conversation died. They looked at his hands, then at the mud caked into the seams of his work, and then at each other. One of them pointed at the stain on his shoulder and let out a sharp, jagged laugh. They called him a fool, their voices cutting through the quiet street. They asked if he enjoyed living in a ruin, if the rent money was even worth the dirt under his fingernails. He felt the space between them widen, a cold distance that had nothing to do with the physical gap on the sidewalk. Their grins were tight, dismissive, treating his effort like a joke told at his expense. He stood still, the weight of their words hitting harder than the heavy pipes he had moved all weekend. The laughter continued, casual and cruel, leaving him isolated in the middle of the sidewalk, a target for their scorn. Carlos looked at them, but the words did not land. He did not defend the work or explain the potential. He simply turned his boots heavy on the pavement and walked back toward the duplex. He pulled the small, worn notebook from his pocket, the leather cover soft from constant handling. Inside were the dates and the figures. He sat on the front porch, ignoring the distant sound of their departing laughter. He opened the mailbox. 3 envelopes sat inside, thick and rectangular. He pulled them out, one by one. The paper was crisp, the ink fresh. He tore the first seal, slid out the check, and held it to the light. The numbers represented hours behind the steering wheel, the ache in his lower back, and the nights he had spent patching the basement. He did not see paper, he saw the mortgage payment. He walked into the hallway, unlocked the heavy wooden door of the office, and slid the checks into the metal lockbox. The sound of the key turning was the only answer he needed. The mockery from the street felt like a whisper compared to the weight of the payments now sitting in his hand. He closed the box, turned the bolt, and started calculating the next month. 2 years had stripped the ruinous look from the duplex. The yard was mowed, the windows held clean glass, and every unit was occupied. Carlos walked the perimeter on a Tuesday morning, checking the fence line and the condition of the gutters. He stopped at each door, listening to the muffled sounds of life inside a radio playing. A door closing, a conversation behind a wall. He had no more vacancies to fill. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with his ledger open. The rent checks arrived with a rhythmic consistency that had not existed before. He tallied the total, subtracted the maintenance costs, and stared at the remainder. It was a surplus. For the first time, the duplex was not a liability draining his savings. It was a machine generating its own momentum. He took a pen and underlined the final balance. The numbers were not just ink, they were the fuel for the next move. He looked out the window at the city, no longer seeing it as a gridlock of traffic, but as a map of potential. The duplex had done its work. It was time to find the next brick. The second unit sat across town, a mirror of his first struggles but with a higher price tag. Carlos parked his taxi outside, the engine ticking as it cooled in the rain. He looked at the bank balance on his phone, then at the building. It was a leap that felt like walking off a ledge. Inside the bank, the loan officer tapped a pen against the desk, questioning the viability of a second mortgage so soon. Carlos signed the papers, his hand steady, even as the weight of the debt settled into his chest. He was no longer just a landlord. He was a borrower, tethered to 2 properties and twice the maintenance. The numbers in his ledger now showed more red than blacks. He walked out to the parking lot, the wind cutting through his shirt. The reality of the monthly payments arrived with a sharp, metallic taste in his mouth. He climbed back into his taxi, turned the key, and looked at the clock. The city lights blurred as he pulled away from the curb. He needed more fares. He needed to outrun the interest. He drove, the rhythm of the road now dictated by the deadline of his own expansion. The taxi became his mobile office. He stopped sleeping through the night. If he was not behind the wheel collecting fares, he was on a ladder patching a roof or in a basement clearing a drain. His life collapsed into a cycle of gas stations, hardware stores, and bank lobbies. He treated his time like currency, counting every minute spent in traffic against the potential of a new down payment. He learned to negotiate paint prices, to fix faulty wiring, and to read lease agreements while waiting at red lights. The second unit turned a profit, so he bought a third. The third paid for the fourth. He stopped looking at the city as a maze of streets and began seeing it as a series of potential investments. He bought a fixer-upper on 5th, then a neglected townhouse on the edge of the industrial district. He became a machine of pure utility. He did not talk to his old friends. He did not take breaks. He was a blur of movement, constantly driving, constantly saving, and constantly signing. With every contract, the pile of keys on his dashboard grew heavier. He was not just buying buildings anymore. He was buying the city, one unit at a time. The keys on his dashboard no longer fit in his pocket. He moved from single units to multi-family complexes, his name appearing on legal filings that once intimidated him. He sat in a glass-walled office, not a basement, staring across a mahogany table at investors who had ignored him 2 years prior. They looked at his ledger, then at him, and finally offered a nod of professional respect. The deal involved 8 units at once. His hands did not shake as he signed the documents. He walked out of the building and back to the curb where his taxi waited. The vehicle looked smaller, its yellow paint dull against the glass and steel of the city he was now carving a path through. He was a player now, not a passenger of his own circumstances. He drove to a property on the north side, inspected a new roof installation, and checked his bank portal. The numbers were staggering, but they felt like data, not fortune. He realized then that the taxi was merely a shell. He had outgrown the gridlock. He had outgrown the need for fares. He drove through the evening traffic, not searching for a flag down, but scanning the horizon for the next site to acquire. The ledger sat open on the passenger seat. 14 lines filled, 14 addresses marked with completion. He sat in the taxi, the engine idling, watching a cluster of brick buildings across the street. He dialed the contact on his phone. The conversation lasted less than a minute. He agreed to the price, signed the electronic transfer, and hung up. The 15th key was now his. He looked at the dashboard, where 14 other keys lay in a jagged, metallic pile. He picked up the 15th, turning it in the dim light of the street lamp. The weight of it felt different. It was not just brass and steel, it was the physical proof of every hour lost to the road. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and thought back to the first duplex. The peeling paint, the leaking pipes, the laughter of those who doubted him. All of it had led to this silence. He felt the vibration of the engine beneath his palms, the last remaining tether to his old life. He reached for the ignition. He turned the key. The engine died, and for the first time in years, the city grew quiet. He did not look at the meter. He simply pushed the door open and stepped onto the pavement. The commercial complex loomed over the sidewalk, a monolith of glass and polished steel that mirrored the sky. Carlos stood at the base of the structure, his boots planted firmly on concrete he now owned. People moved in and out of the lobby, their pace hurried, unaware that the person watching them had once been a ghost in their traffic patterns. He touched the cool, brushed metal of the entrance frame. It was solid. It was permanent. He looked up, tracing the lines of the windows until they vanished into the clouds. There was no engine noise here, no ticking meter, no frantic scanning for passengers. Only the steady hum of a building that functioned because of his decisions. He pulled a heavy ring of keys from his pocket. The weight shifted in his palm, a dense concentration of brass and responsibility. He had spent years fixing leaks and patching holes, but this was different. This was architecture, scale, and intent. He moved toward the revolving doors, his shadow stretching long across the polished floor of the foyer. The transition was complete. He was no longer the one driving through the city. He was the one who had built a piece of it. He took a breath, felt the climate-controlled air of the lobby, and moved toward the reception desk. The property manager waited by the central desk, a tablet in hand. Carlos walked across the lobby, his stride measured and steady. He stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the keys, then at the man who would now handle the daily friction of the complex. The manager reached out, palm open. Carlos hesitated. For years, the keys were his pulse, his direct link to every pipe, every door, every problem that needed solving. To give them up was to erase the only identity he had known for a decade. He felt the sharp edges of the metal bite into his skin one last time. Then, he let go. The keys fell into the manager's palm with a metallic clink that echoed against the high ceilings. The manager began explaining the morning's maintenance logs, but Carlos barely heard the words. He watched the man turn and walk toward the utility elevator. The burden of the building, the pressure of the leaks, the constant demand for his hands and time, it was gone. He stood alone in the center of the foyer. He was no longer a worker. He was an architect of his own future. He felt the weight of his own hands, empty and free, and walked toward the glass doors leading back to the street. The taxi sat at the curb, an island of worn fabric and faded plastic amidst the clean glass of the complex. Carlos approached the vehicle. It looked smaller than he remembered, a cramped box that had contained his entire world for years. He pulled the door handle, heard the familiar mechanical whine of the latch, and slid into the driver's seat. The smell of stale coffee and road dust hit him instantly, a sensory catalog of 10,000 miles. He closed the door, cutting off the city noise. The silence inside was heavy, thick with the echoes of every fare he had ever carried. He looked at the dashboard, the cracked gauge, the tape holding the radio in place, the worn groove in the steering wheel where his grip had rested for thousands of hours. He did not reach for the gear shift. He did not scan the rear view for a passenger. He simply sat, his hands resting motionless on his lap. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that the man behind the wheel was no longer the driver. He felt the vibration of the idling engine through his boots, a fading heartbeat of his past life. He looked at the meter, still dark, and felt the immense weight of the transition. He had arrived at the end of the road, and for the first time, he had nowhere else to drive. His fingers brushed the cold metal of the key, still slotted in the ignition. For a moment, his mind flickered back to the very first fare, the sound of the door closing. The destination called out. The immediate need to move. That version of himself was a ghost. He gripped the key firmly, feeling the resistance of the spring. He turned it back. The engine gave a final shuddering gasp before the silence rushed in to fill the vacuum. The dashboard lights died, plunging the cabin into a sudden, cool shadow. Carlos reached out, his movements deliberate and slow, and pressed the button on the taximeter. The numbers flickered, groaned, and finally settled at 0. The red light that had dictated his income for years vanished. He took a long, steady breath, feeling the air move through his lungs without the pressure of a ticking clock. He pushed the door open. It swung wide, hitting the stop with a heavy metallic thud. He stepped out onto the pavement, his boots striking the ground with a finality that resonated against the surrounding glass. He did not look back at the steering wheel. He did not check the rear view. He left the key in the ignition, stepped away from the curb, and let the door swing shut behind him. Carlos did not look back. The sound of the city surged around him, but it no longer felt like a barrier or a gridlock. It felt like a landscape he had carefully mapped. He walked past the curb, his stride lengthening. He reached out and pressed his palm against the cool, solid surface of a stone pillar, part of the complex he now possessed. It was cold, immovable, and entirely his. He looked up. The glass towers caught the light, reflecting a horizon he had once only viewed through a windshield. He began to walk toward the center of the district. The transition was complete. Every street corner he passed had once been a destination for a stranger. Now, they were markers of his own design. He moved with the rhythm of someone who owned his time, his path, and his destination. He passed a construction site, the smell of fresh mortar and steel grounding him to the reality of his journey. He had built this world one brick, one payment, and one sacrifice at a time. The city lights began to flicker on, illuminating the path ahead. He stepped forward into the glow, no longer a passenger in his own life, but the architect of the ground beneath his feet. He walked into the skyline, and he did not stop.